David, in the early hours, the word I would use to describe it is pandemonium. There was a lot of confusion and shock from the people who were there on the ground. We spoke to people who didn't know the whereabouts of their family members and friends who were there overnight, and there was even a loudspeaker that was calling names to try to locate people, as well as just an array of emergency services, police, Israeli security, and then a lot of people in shock. One conversation I had was with a group of young men who had come there the night before. They thought it was going to be an evening of celebration, but of course it descended into tragedy. Take a listen to a little bit of the conversation that we had.
It was crazy. I was by a different fire, and all of a sudden, you just, like, this little lane in between just splits open, and no one knows what's happening. You're asking, why is there, like, lane splitting? You're trying to go. People are trying to move here. And we just find out that, like, I personally was walking. I see just body bags, people walking, and I just looked once, and I just didn't register. And then I just, like, whoa, there's actually dead human beings here. And we were just actually here. I went back to the place I'm staying. I came back now to help search for a very close friend of mine's younger brother. We just found out also unfortunately passed away. So yeah, it's I don't know, I'm just a simple teenager from America, just here visiting. I would just really say it's all about just love the person next to you, unity. This is like a super sad time, but with God's help we will all get through it together. Any event like this with this amount of people is going to be very hard. So the most respect and gratitude to all the service workers that came. Did a great job.
So you can see there that in the hours immediately after the tragedy, one of the most complicated tasks was to identify bodies and notify the families. And there was also a lot of confusion for that as well. We have to remember as well that it was right before the Sabbath. The Sabbath was entering, and a lot of those people, obviously they're ultra-Orthodox people, so they observe the Sabbath. So there was a rush as well to notify the families, identify the bodies, and try to maintain connection and let people know what was happening. But of course, they were competing against the clock. And then when you were listening to Hebrew media, when you were listening to a lot of the commentators, they were talking about blame. Who was at fault for this? There were many who said that this was a tragedy that everyone could see coming, and that it was basically an accident waiting to happen. And when I went in and closer and I stood exactly in the spot where that tragedy did occur, you could see how narrow it truly was. It's stark to stand there and think about hundreds of thousands of people in a space that was really maybe just a bit, maybe double the span of my arm length. So it was really very obvious from being on the ground that there were so many people, and it caused so much confusion. That compounded by the fact that there was still a lot of damage, but the facility was still being used overnight for prayers. We saw people lighting candles in that very spot and still trying to continue with this weekend, which again for them marks a celebration and a holiday. So a lot of confusion, a lot of pandemonium, a lot of sorrow. But again, as well, what we heard perhaps in that interview, there was optimism, there was gratitude towards a lot of the emergency services and people who came to the aid of those who were in dire need in that morning.
Certainly the positive angle of this was just robust response by the emergency forces there. Did you see much sign of that? A lot of the reports claim that luckily, the EMT services and the first responders were there in force based on the large crowds. You think they did the best they could? Is that at least what's coming out of this? Is that was a positive angle of this issue?
Yes, and as we were driving towards the scene, I actually called a lot of Israeli paramedics. I called the senior member of MADA, that's the Israeli equivalent of the Red Cross, and they said we'd already dispatched 230 ambulances there in advance. They had been very prepared and well prepared for this event. They knew that it was like what it was like from years past. And immediately as the event started to unfold, as they told me, they started to dispatch ambulances to try to get these people treated in hospitals across the country, because of course there were at least 150 who were left wounded at the time. That's what was being said. So they dispatched ambulances, they dispatched emergency services. There were those who came to the aid of those, even though they weren't involved in the incident itself. We saw members of a local Arab village come and try to give out water and food, even though they're fasting for Ramadan, to try to help people. Volunteers who came to try to help search for people and try to get people out of the area. But still, there was an underlying feeling of pandemonium and chaos, because there was just there were a lot of details that remained unclear, missing friends, missing family members, unclear as to exactly how the event unfolded and what was the protocol afterwards. So a lot of robust response, but still a lack of clarity, specifically in that morning, and then of course leading on and extending on into the late afternoon.